Hey friend, today I have something a little different. I sat down recently with the author Frederick Fahey, who, after an impressive career as a medical physicist at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, has taken a fascinating turn into the world of historical fiction. His debut novel is The Scoundrel's Son, and it picks up where Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper left off, but not in the way that you might expect. Fred takes us on a journey through the Tudor world, following Tom Canty as he grows up in the royal court, befriends Edward VI, meets Lady Jane Grey, and wrestles with what it means to be a good person in a complicated world. In this conversation, we talk about what inspired Fred to give Tom his own voice, how he blended fictional and historical characters, and why friendship, loss, and identity are at the heart of this story. Plus, we get the inside scoop on the incredible book cover, which was designed by the same artist who did the Wicked book cover. So that's a fun connection. If you want to be part of these chats and discussions live, you can do that by becoming a patron or a member. So going to patreon.com/Englandcast or just clicking join this channel. We do pretty regular monthly author chats with authors like Fred and others. So thanks so much for watching. Let's dive right in and learn more about Edward VI. And if you're a fan of Mark Twain and The Prince of the Pauper, this is definitely going to be one you want to watch the whole way through. All right, let's get into it. All right, so you have this wonderful book. You have you should tell me before we even get started the story behind the cover of your book, because you shared something very interesting about that, The Scoundrel's Son. Tell me about this beautiful cover.
One of the advantages of having going to a small publisher is they said, you do the cover. My writing coach told me she doesn't even think Stephen King gets to pick what his cover looks like. But there's so I live in this island off of Portland, Maine called Peaks Island, and there's some very talented illustrators on the island, and one happens to be Doug Smith. So he lives about maybe three-quarters of a mile from me here, and he did. The original cover of Wicked. Not the Broadway poster, but the actual
Right, the
book
actual
cover.
book. I can tell
So
that now that you're saying it. It looks familiar.
so he also read my book very carefully because although I probably had veto power, he chose the six scenes he decided to illustrate. And he has on this side of the book cover, part one, it's a little bit lighter. On this side, part two, it's a little bit darker.
Yeah.
And it was great working with him, and Scott Nash, another illustrator, worked with us. Scott helped design it. Doug did the illustration.
Awesome. So your book kind of picks up or picks off. I would think it's not necessarily a sequel to The Prince and the Pauper, Mark Twain, but it's more of like a companion, I guess you could say. So you pick up the story of Tom Canty from The Prince and the Pauper. And if people don't know that story, maybe you can just give me a little. In the first chapter, you kind of give this little synopsis of The Prince and the Pauper, and maybe you can tell me a little bit about kind of the story and how you pick it up. And I'm curious, what was it about Tom Canty's voice that kept kind of tugging at you and why you wanted to write this companion, for lack of I don't want to call it a sequel because it's not a sequel so much, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sort of calling it a continuation in a way. But so when I was a kid, I saw the Errol Flynn movie version of The Prince and the Pauper, and at the end of it, I said, "Wow, it was, Edward really a real person." So I ran to my Collier's Encyclopedia, 20 volumes, and looked it up, and lo and behold, a lot of people sort of know the story of Prince and the Pauper, but they don't realize that the prince is an actual prince. He's Edward, Edward the Sixth, and King of England, and so that intrigued me. And and what Twain says about Tom is that he lived to be an old man, but my encyclopedia said that Edward did not. So I wondered what happened next. Actually, in The Prince and the Pauper, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more later, they don't spend much time together. They sort of meet, they decide they're going to exchange places, and then Edward goes on often has these harrowing adventures in the city, which he thought would be cooler than it actually is. And Tom's in the palace trying to make believe he's the prince. And then the king dies, and well, so I thought, well, what happens next? And so now, many years later, I decided now I know what happened next. And I like the other thing that came into it, which we maybe we'll talk a little bit about later, is probably about 10 or 20 years ago, I visited Tower of London, and the yeoman beefeater that was given the tour talked about Lady Jane Grey. So then I was intrigued by her, and her tale. And so I thought, well, it'd be sort of fun to add a teenage girl to the mix. So I decided to do that, and so then I figured that that's how I sort of got the idea of it. I wanted to know what happened next.
Very cool. Yeah, and there's sort of like I don't want to give anything away, but there's an interesting like tension like with Tom and Jane Grey. I don't know, he seems to like want to impress her and it's almost like a little bit of a love interest, but not really, like kind of from afar sort of thing. It's cool. It's neat to bring that in like that. So you frame it like a memoir, Tom as a grown man looking back. And I'm curious why you framed it that way. What made you decide to have it come from that perspective?
Partly it was this is the first novel I ever wrote after being a scientist for many years, and I retired. I decided I'd try to write a novel, and I figured, well, one way to tell a tale is to tell a tale, so I thought that might be easier, and it is in some ways, but it's limiting in other ways, right? Because all you know is what Tom knows. It is in retrospect, so I'm loosening it up a little bit. He's telling it 20 years later. So that was sort of why I chose it. I said, okay, it's going to be in first person. It's going to be a tale told to somebody, and it's going to, I'm not going to do what Twain did. I'm not going to try to do my version of Elizabethan English. It's pretty much going to be modern English, because I did, because again, it was my first book, and I wanted to make it as easy as possible. But I think it worked well. I mean, I thought that because Tom, it brings a certain perspective to the royal court that's unique, and I thought that that would be something that would be interesting to see.
Yeah, well, congratulations on this first book. It's a marvelous first book. It's a delight
Thank
to
you.
read. Yeah. So I'm interested in this friendship between Tom and Edward. Of course, Tom goes off and he's the king's ward at this point and living his life. And how you envisioned, how you decided to imagine or depict their friendship as they both grew up and entered adolescence. How did you decide to play it like that and to portray it the way you did?
Yeah, one of I think the themes of the book, or one of the things I wanted to capture, is those friendships we have when we're that age. Let's say the story sort of starts when they're 11 and it ends when they're 15 or 16 years old. And in your life, sometimes some of your strongest friendships you've ever have are in that time period. And so, like I said, Edward and Tom didn't spend much time together, actually in Prince and the Pauper. So then I wanted to expand that on, are they still friends? Do they still have a relationship? Did just Tom go his way and Edward went his way? And then I thought, well, then Tom brings something unique. Edward, King of England now, right? So he spends a lot of time with people a lot older than he is, and that Tom comes in and he's a kid, and he's the same exact age to the day as Edward, and so they do little boy things. I have a scene where Tom tells a joke and milk comes out of Edward's nose,
Right.
the King of England's nose.
Right. I remember you said something like, "Oh, that made milk hit my nose" or something. It was quite funny. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was trying to capture that. Friendship is a very strong part of what I wanted to present here.
Yeah. From your research and what you learned about Edward as you were researching this book and kind of, do you think Edward needed friendships like that? Do you think Edward had any friendships like that?
He did because he was at school, I don't think he was educated just by himself. I think there were other there. I can't not sure if I can remember his name, but it was an Irish kid, for example, like something
And
like
wasn't
Barry.
Robert Dudley, I think, they're part of it, like Elizabeth
Yeah,
and
yeah, he did know Robert Dudley a little bit, and so in that family, but so he did, and some of his other cousins, Ned Seymour, he went, maybe he knew. Um, but that's still in the, sort of the realm of, either school and being king and being, being the royal family. So he's able to sort of let his guard down when he's with Tom. And that's, and I think that that makes it a little bit easier. On the other hand, as the story progresses and things, and they get a little older, Tom brings a unique perspective to what's going on. Tom, he doesn't have as much schooling as Edward or Jane, but he has street smarts that they don't have. He's a little bit guarded because he's not had an easy childhood, and so he knows that there's good people in the world, but he also knows that there are not. And he learns through this story that even if you're a noble or a royal, that doesn't, you could still be a scheming
Yeah,
person.
sure, sure. Yeah, I remember there was a scene where one of his friends, not the noble, when they were playing and he was cheating at card gem, was cheating at cards and stuff, and it was just this awareness on. I thought it was like an interesting dichotomy, playing like both sides, the noble sides, and like that kind of thing is everywhere, and him
Yeah.
being more introduced to that early on. There's this wonderful cast of characters that you have, Father Christian and Robert Nobson. How did you come up with these characters? Did any of them surprise you as you were writing? Did any of them just appear to you? Did they take on bigger roles than you had imagined? Tell me about them.
You mentioned Father Christian. That's sort of a funny thing because if you are familiar with The Prince and the Pauper, he is friendly with a priest called Father Andrew. So I started writing my first draft with Father Andrew, and then it occurred to me, wait a minute, Father Andrew died. It's in Popper, so I had to make a shift. I think one of the other, I'm very much, I like characters, and I'm a very character-driven kind of reader and writer. So I think one of the ones that I liked and had a bigger part than I would have expected is Richard, the king's head groom. They sort of bond because Richard knows what Tom brings to the to the show in both early on and then later after, when things sort of evolve, I guess I could say. So he is an interesting character and he has a respect for Tom. But sometimes I had to invent a character like Richard because how do you how did how you know how do you grease the wheel to get him to Tom into the places where he wants to be? Like there's another, William the guard, the guard who roughed him up in The Prince and the Pauper now befriends him, So, anyways, so I liked him, and Father Christian is sort of a little bit of a spiritual. Tom's not really that spiritual, but and then Robert is more like his mentor and he's an apprentice and that provides. And then I drag Miles Hendon in from The Prince and the Pauper because we need someone who knows something about covert
Yeah.
operations.
Yeah, for sure. And how did like you it's interesting because you brought in normally with historical fiction, you're bringing in real people with invented people and characters and mixing things. And then you also have another layer where you're bringing in characters from another historical fiction book from 100 and something odd years ago, almost to what, 150 years ago. So how did you mix together all of these characters? What were the challenges with that? And also bringing the idea of like bringing in real characters and having historical accuracy while also being faithful to the characters that Mark Twain created and then putting your own spin on them and then also bringing in the characters that you had to invent as well. Tell me a little bit about like how you were able to do that process.
I'm the person who ripped off Mark Twain who did not win the Pulitzer Prize. So, so kudos to Percival Everett for James, but it's about so I followed his approach, and I thought it would be easier again. My first novel, okay, I got history, I got a scaffold, I know some things that happened, and I've got some characters that are good, that are worthwhile, Tom, mostly, and a little bit his family. I'd probably expand on his mother a little bit more than you probably learn, from the Prince and the Pauper. I mean, she's a good woman in the Prince and the Pauper, but I think I make her funnier. And so I was trying to take advantage of that. But then the history thing, I've exchanged some emails with an author from Boston, Bill Martin, who writes historical fiction, not Tudor, but he goes American historical fiction from the Revolution up to the 60s. And he told me that when he starts a book, his research is a mile wide and an inch deep. Like
Hmm.
he knows a little about a lot. And then as the story progresses, he starts to things start to pile up as you need to know more things. And I sort of when I started, I sort of didn't want to hamstring string myself. I knew some things. I knew some things about Jane and Edward and the Tudors, and so I took advantage of that. But I sort of told myself, you know, I'm not a historian. I'm an author, and I don't mean to sound like I'm putting myself in the same category as Shakespeare. But if you want to know history, don't read Shakespeare.
Right. Sure.
That's like saying Game of Thrones is history, right? I mean,
Right.
it's a story. But on the other hand, I'm not Quentin Tarantino. I try to stay with what actually happened.
Hmm.
Sharon Tate really did get murdered by the Manson family.
Yeah. Okay.
So I tried to not, so Jane was, things were going to happen, and I wasn't going to change them. I moved some things around. I moved some things happen different places than they
Mhm.
actually happen just to make it convenient for Tom to be there.
Mhm.
So anyways, I tried to mix it in, and I tried to early on. I probably did more, you know, exposition here, and my writing coach really pushed me to try to make it more seamless, like try to tell the history as part of the story, and so I tried to do that. I hope I did, and I hope I gave people enough history that they didn't have to keep running back to Wikipedia to figure out what the heck was going on.
Yeah. Easier though than your Collier's encyclopedia after reading
Yeah,
Popper
yeah.
though, right?
Yeah. So I tried to mix the history in, and but not make it too onerous, but make it see how it fit into the story.
Hmm.
And some places I did more, and then some places I did less. Obviously, Jane becomes a more important, in some ways, maybe the Tom Jane relationship
Hmm.
becomes the relationship in the story. Um, but I mean, Thomas Seymour and Edward Seymour sort of,
Hmm.
um, and John Dudley, they sort of come in and out. They are, they are in the story, but they more come in and out. And even Queen Mary,
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And this book, there's so many kind of deep themes in it, even though I know The Prince and the Pauper was written, what, for children of all ages or something, didn't Twain say? And
yes, he
this kind
did.
of has that same sort of style. So it's not reading like a really deep kind of thing, but at the same time, there are some really deep themes in there around class and identity and loss and temptation. And I'm just wondering, like, themes that if there were any that felt most personal to you, how you kind of wove those themes in and made it accessible in a way that it didn't feel like one was reading like, I don't know, some really it felt easy enough to read. You could read it before bed and fall asleep, and it wasn't like really super hard reading, obviously. So how did you work these themes into a story that was based off of a children's story, and still make it kind of have that thought-provoking part to it?
Even Twain, if the parts where Edward is getting into trouble in London is some of it's pretty dark, and it's a good thing that Miles Hendon's there to get him out of different jams. I there were two aspects of this that like I said, friendship. These young, these young people being very close friends, and so some of it I tried to, as I said, as Patti Smith would say, they wanted to make them just kids,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, there's some loss, as you say, and Tom, on the first paragraph of the book, points out that he's going to go through some things that a young man shouldn't you have to deal with. And if and there's an aspect of it, people have asked me, why do you call it the scoundrel's son? And my writing coach said to me once, that, stories, as you try to frame them, are what does the main character want and what's in their way? What's the obstacle to that they have to get around? And what he
Mm,
wants is not to be his father. His
right.
father is a scoundrel, his father's a jerk, and he really wants to be a good person and he wants to work at that. But what he learns in this story to some extent is even if you are a really good person, bad things still happen to you.
Mm,
And and what do you do about them? And how do you get around them? He's not so religious to say, well, it's just God's plan and that's it. Other people in the story do have that perspective, but Tom doesn't necessarily. So he's trying to come to grips with that. And uh, un, well, I don't know whether it's unfortunate, but I, as a young person, dealt with loss, losing someone who was a member of my family, because
mhm.
you can imagine this time in the 1500s that that people die all the time, but it's another thing when it's your best friend, or something
Sure.
like that, then that changes, how you grasp that. And so that rang to me, and I wanted to explore that a little bit, but also in the context that these three kids are friends and like each other. And yeah, I think Tom is smitten.
Yeah. 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 It's very sweet. And talk to me. You have Jane, and then there's another female character, Allie, who is a friend of Tom's as well. And she's a really super cool character. I really loved her. How did you like what inspired her, and how did you feel about writing these kind of very strong female characters in the Tudor world? Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts with that.
That's always something when you're writing your first novel. How am I going to do a decent job in making these people real? So we do have these two young female characters, Allie, Allison, who lives in the neighborhood. She's poor, but she's spunky. I'm married to a former tomboy, I guess you'd say, who wanted to go out for the football team kind of thing, and so Allie, you know, she likes to climb things. She can run faster than anyone in the neighborhood, and she's not above punching someone in the nose who's given her a bad
Mhm.
time. And Jane's a totally other side of that, right? I mean, Jane is very, one of the most educated young ladies in England of the time, and would much prefer to read a book than to go hunting with her parents, and so it's a little bit of a yin and a yang there. But I wanted Allie to be Tom's friend and confidant, as the story goes on. She's the person in the neighborhood that he really, you know, um, tells what's going on in his complicated life.
Yeah.
And she gives him a rule, she tells, that try to figure out how you would deal with these people if they weren't royal, if
Mhm.
they were
Mhm.
just normal people, and so I tried to make her, I I'm glad you liked her because I tried to make her real, and Katie Holman said that she really liked my portrayal of Jane. And so I'm glad. It's so much so that my second book, my main character is a woman.
Oh, wow.
It's
All
so
right.
And I was willing to even take that leap, and that
Okay.
they, so
Yeah.
anyways, so thank you. I think she's interesting. I like her a lot. I tend to like my characters.
Cool. Well, that's helpful if you're spending a lot of time with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you share what your second book is on?
Yeah, it's totally different. It is historic, but it's mostly based on my grandmother's life.
Okay.
So it takes place in the 1920s and 30s. In a phrase, my grandmother at the 19-year-old mother of two leaves her abusive husband and doesn't go back. And then spends the next 10 years trying to make a go of it. That's hard enough to do in 2025, never
Yeah.
mind 1926.
Yes.
So that's the story. And my grandmother didn't talk about her life that much. My mother
Mhm.
was like the happiest person I ever knew, and then I learned her young life was not that easy. So I wanted to, so I took what few words my grandmother said about her life and then wrote a 300-page novel.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. That's very cool. That's I'm sure that was an emotional journey as well
Yeah.
to go.
It was
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. There's a that well, so also I want to say one of our guests is if writing or is watching from Paris. So hello to Paris. And they ask, I do love historical fictions. I couldn't find a French translation online. So do you have any plans to translate your book into French or anything else?
Um, I do have a a f- a foreign agent. That sounds
Yeah.
more intrigued than what it means. But I have a woman who contacted me who's trying to line up translation and foreign rights. So I hope so. There is not a French translation um, um, yet, but maybe
But we'll keep
soon.
our fingers crossed.
Right? Yeah.
All right. Very cool. There's a scene that stuck with me when Tom realized that he never asked Edward how he was doing. And it's like this emotional shift in it. Do you remember writing that? And tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that part.
I was thinking sometimes in our lives, and I've been around a bit, and you meet people who are noted or for some reason, not the King of England, but and Tom realizes that he didn't, the king asked him how he was doing, but he didn't ask the king how and not like how was things in Scotland going on, or what are you doing about France, none of that stuff, but just how do you
How
feel,
are you? Yeah.
what's your favorite color, what do you like to do, and do you like music, do you like, these kinds of things. And he decides that if they're really going to be friends, and this is me delving into what friendship means, he has to ask those things, and he has to get more involved in what's going on with Edward, and get into more of that life. I think I also there's a bit of it where he says one thing that he realizes that you know what what Edward needs is an expert in being an 11-year-old boy,
Right. Yeah.
and he says I'm an expert in
I'm the
that,
expert on that.
and
Yeah.
so they start playing chess together. He comes in with a few jokes every time, and it's just 11-year-olds hanging out,
Yeah.
and eating all the snacks that the king can bring.
Yeah, very cool. So my final question is if you could sit down with Mark Twain and show him this book, what would you want him to know about your take on his character, Tom?
Yeah, so as I said, Tom is probably, not as central a character in Prince and the Pauper. It's probably more Edward,
Mm,
and the adventures and misadventures he has out in the London slums, So I wanted to, since I decided I was going to tell this story from Tom's point of view, I wanted to be true, you know. Um, you know, when you write a novel, you're writing a lot of lies to tell a greater truth, I wanted it to be true to to the character that Twain had, but I wanted to figure out where is he 5 years later? Where is that young boy 5 years, 5 years later, and be true and be reason, and this could be a reasonable, extrapolation of that. I tried really hard to find why Twain wrote this book, because Prince and the Pauper came out between Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Huck Finn, yeah, yeah.
And I know he traveled a lot, and went to England a lot. And he has also, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. But
Mm.
why did he write this down? What I did find in his autobiography, and I've written a little thing for my newsletter about it, is his daughter loved this story. The Prince and the Pauper is her favorite story.
Oh, interesting.
Um, so,
Yeah.
uh, and so that was interesting. Twain comes back from the road and they say, "Oh, we have to go to the neighbor's house." And they go to the neighbor's house. He says, "Oh, can I just stay home?" And, they drag him over and they've set up a stage. And her daughter and her friend, they're like 12 at the time, put on a play of The Prince and the Pauper.
How fun. Oh, how fun. That's so cool. What a good story.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
So
Awesome.
I'd like to see, I'd be happy that if he thought that that who Tom was is who he imagined Tom could be
Yeah.
years down the road.
Awesome. Well, Fred, it was lovely to meet you in your book, The Scoundrel's Son. It was a very fun read. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me about it and share your experience. Where can people find you and your books? Plug your stuff.
So, so you can probably find my book almost, it's almost any place that you can buy books, you can, find it. If you go to your bookstore, it may not be on the shelf, but they certainly can order it. So, my publisher does go through Ingram, so it's pretty available. But certainly,
On
the ebook is
Amazon.
only available as Kindle, so only through Amazon, the ebook. And then if you subscribe to Kindle Unlimited, it's part of your subscription. You can read it as part of your subscription. But you can also check out my website, which is frederickfahey.com, and find things from there as well.
Perfect. Awesome. Any parting thoughts you want to leave me with? Anything? You don't have to. I'm just wondering if there's anything I missed that you want to add.
Yeah, people have asked me if there's going to be more, like I said, Tom lived to be an old man. And people have asked me if there's going to be more stories. So I'm working on starting out as a short story, but I don't know where it's going to go.
Okay.
As I said, Twain said he lived to be an old man, so in the time after The Prince and the Pauper, there's a lot of interesting people.
Yeah, there are. Definitely. All right. Well, we will stay tuned for that and see what
Yeah.
happens.
So that's one of the things that's out there. I'm working on a little short story now that I hope is interesting.
Okay. Well, Fred, thanks for taking the
Oh, and
time.
Heather, thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. This was really fun.
Awesome.